Well, good morning, everyone. Excited to have you all back for our firm's third webinar. We are just loving doing these. It's a great experience. They're fun to put on, but they're also really fun to interact with people after the fact. That's been one pleasure that I've had out of these. I didn't expect when we started doing them was the opportunity to meet new people, to email back and forth, share information with the participants in each of the webinars. And so I encourage you to do so. I would love to hear from you. And I'm really excited about the topic that we have today. Before we get into it, I want to remind you that for those in Georgia who are watching, we have approved for CLE credit. We have your bar numbers. We have paid for the CLE, and we will be submitting those to the bar for credit this week on your behalf. We also will have the slides from today's presentation, also the video available in, I think, 2 days. So be looking for that, and we'll get that out to you shortly. So that's all the setup net for the webinar today, and I just want to get right into the topic. I've got with me my law partner and good friend, Ben Baker. We've known each other for, I guess, my whole law career. Been working together since I've been at Beasley Allen 13 years ago. We've had the opportunity to work on numerous cases together and had a lot of fun. This is probably my favorite one. We went all the way to verdict. Might be one of my favorite cases I've ever worked on because of the family that was involved in it. And I will with just kind of, what do you think, Ben?
Those were great folks and really made the trial that much more important to win and to work hard for the clients. I mean, they're just really great folks. And I think as we go through the presentation today, we'll be able to tell you a couple of stories about the family and just how the courthouse staff interacted with them. It was something that I had not experienced before.
Yeah, that was unique. And I was, we got involved in this case. Kind of a little background was there was another law firm that had the case. They had hired an accident reconstructionist who was, unfortunately, he was just wrong. Our own accident reconstructionist was that we were presented in the case when we got in it had very, very, unsupportable opinions. And so we were kind of thinking, how do we win this case? We really had to find a way because we represented just one of the best families ever. The Dial family are just, I love them. I still love them. And it's an honor to represent people like them. But I really Ben and I wanted to really take you through how we did it. And how did we got a $12 million verdict in a rollover case involving a Toyota 4Runner. It wasn't a stability case like you normally see or a roof crush case. The accident happened really I'll let Ben explain it later, but the end of the accident, she rolled into a telephone pole. She was pinned there for
about 2 hours.
Yeah, about 2 hours. And while they were going to life flight her to the hospital, her mom and dad were waiting at the hospital for her. Her mom was a nurse, and they were there waiting on the helicopter to come back. While they were trying to get her removed, there was a power line on the telephone pole, and they had to get the power turned off before they could get her out. And she expired in that 2 hours while they waited. It was such a sad story, but the helicopter came back without her. And that's how the mom found out that her daughter had passed. And it was just heartbreaking. I don't know when that came out in trial, I don't know that there was a dry eye, including my own, in the room. It was tough to hear.
Well, and part of that too was the paramedics that were on the scene with her for 2 hours. What came out at trial, she was conscious the whole time, and she was talking to them. And the two main paramedics actually testified that they quit being paramedics because of what they saw and experienced in this wreck. And again, it was just there was a lot of tears by a lot of people in that courtroom, including the jury.
Sure was.
And Lacee is the one holding the flowers with a pigtail.
Yeah, sweet girl. She was just the light of that family. She was going to Clemson to college. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She worked about 3 jobs. I think she was homecoming queen. She played sports. She did it all. I can't remember how many people went to her funeral. It was
about 1,000, I think.
Yeah.
And there, she wanted to be a veterinarian, and in fact was taking an application to a vet's office to kind of do an internship on the day of the wreck.
Yeah, that's what she was doing when she died. And so, so here's how we proceeded in this really difficult case where.
But and I guess the last thing I'll say about the family, they're very close knit, and this community knew about this wreck and knew this family, so that helped us at trial.
Yeah. So this was a rollover case, as I mentioned earlier, but it wasn't the standard rollover case. Like you have stability claims, you have side curtain airbag claims, you have roof closure claims, seat belts are defective or doors come open in rollovers. There's a lot of more common defects in rollovers than what we had in this case. In this case, the defect was that the rear axle was defective in that it broke in the crash when it shouldn't have. And so that you can see on the left side of the screen, that's the rear axle, just for your education. On the right side of the screen is the housing. The axle goes inside of that. And it's, that's what your back two wheels are held in place with, is the rear axle and the axle housing. These axles, because when you're driving a car or a SUV like a 4Runner, you're constantly hitting things such as curbs. My daughter hits curbs probably every time she drives a car, and I get a bill for a new tire about once every 2 or 3 months. And then you have a lot of potholes and rough roads and lots of things on the roadway that you need to have extremely hard axles. It's got to be harder than normal metal to really stand up to the rigors of a road environment. And so what they do to make this axle hard enough to not break when you go over speed bumps or accidentally hit a curb or hit a pothole is they do go through a process called induction hardening. And that's done by sending an electrical current through the metal. And when you can send this current through the metal, you've got to get it exactly right. If you do it too short, the metal's not hard enough. If you do it for too long, you overheat it. And when it gets overheated, then you get problems such as cracking and weak points in the metal. We found some papers and a lot of research on this topic of induction heating. And so we had to learn a lot about the process and working the case up. And what we found out is that problems in induction heating really occur when the little coil that's wrapped around the metal and puts the electric current through it come in contact with geometric features on the metal. So if it's just a straight piece of metal with no geometric features on it, then the induction hardening process generally goes pretty smooth. But in this instance where you've got these ridges or geometric features on the metal, then you have to be really careful in those spots to make sure you don't overheat the metal. We found that metal fails. This is the fatigue design handbook. One of the things that the third reason that metal can fail is poor choice of material or heat treatment. So if you got a bad heat treating process, which is what we've been talking about, then your metal can fail. That was something that we used through our experts in the trial of the case. So here's what you got. This is the end of the axle, and sure enough, there is a step up radius. There's that geometric feature that's in place on the axle that broke, and you can see where it fractured right there is exactly where those papers said it would fail in the geometric feature. And it's because the induction heating process was done too long at that spot. This was an interesting thing that I did at trial. We took the corporate representative deposition of Toyota's kind of engineer who knew more about the axle process than anybody else, and they put him up to talk about it, but he spoke Japanese. I had an interpreter. It was very choppy. And so what did I do? The rules say that you can use the deposition of a party for any purpose. And so as a party member, corporate representative, all I did with him was pick 5 points that I wanted to use. I put his picture on the screen, and during opening statement, I said, I took this man's deposition and this is what he said. So I interpreted I could use it for any purpose by just not even playing it all, just telling the jury in opening statement what he did, and then I didn't ever play it. There was a lot of things that were very helpful out of that deposition. He didn't understand when axles would fail and wouldn't fail. He didn't understand when acceleration to the outside of the wheel, which became real important, as you'll see in this case in a moment. Didn't understand what kind of forces that it would take to cause an axle to fail. He didn't understand, about whether a gouge mark in asphalt could cause it. He never saw an axle that had a overload fracture, which is what the defense theory was. Their theory was that this crash was just too severe, and therefore it was an overload fracture, and it was just nothing that could be avoided. And he didn't know if Toyota ever had any axles that didn't pass the heat induction process, which is unbelievable. I mean, they should have a process where they can get quality control, go in and look after the fact, and they will absolutely have some that fail and they need to pull them before they go on vehicles. Well, they weren't even checking, so he didn't even know if they were doing that. And so that was very useful, but I couldn't play it. It was so boring, frankly, and because
we had a long discussion about it before we decided what to do. And our firm, I had been involved in trying a case against Toyota related to the sudden unintended acceleration defects. And in that case, we had all these depositions of all these Japanese witnesses, and we played parts of them. And from that experience, and I conveyed this to Chris, I really didn't think it was that effective, because in essence, we had the guys sitting there with a blank stare like you're seeing here, and then an interpreter off screen talking. And so I think at the end of the day, if we were going to use it, we would have been better off just reading it rather than using the video. But we thought Chris's option of just putting these things up on the screen during opening would probably be the best way to do it, and it really worked well. Yeah,
it was a good choice for this case. And I'll let Ben talk about this. This is the scene. And
one of the things here was we had accident reconstruction. We really weren't off with each other in terms of what it is. But our reconstructionist went to the scene and did a drone. Drones have become really popular nowadays with our accident reconstruction and visiting the scenes. Now, what you'll see as we come up to the end here, off to the left of the screen, is a guy standing right at a T intersection. There's the pole that you can see that she hit, and we'll show you a demonstration in a minute. But where that guy is standing, there was actually another truck had come to that intersection. He had stopped. There's a man named Mr. Beecham, and he actually witnessed the wreck, and he became a very important part of this case. Let's go to the next slide. So this is Bryant Buckner. He was our accident reconstructionist, and you can see his path for the vehicle. And we'll show you the defense in just a second. She actually had what NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, calls a road edge recovery. For whatever reason, she ran off the road, dropped her passenger side tires off, pulled back on, steered a little too strongly, and it took her right across the center line. And then she attempted to bring it back in. And that's where our witness comes in, Mr. Beecham. And we'll show you in a minute, down towards the end, there's actually a gouge mark that becomes very important in the case.
And I'm going to just interject here. This is what Ben and I do. We do auto products cases involving, defects in motor vehicles. They don't always have to happen in a two vehicle wreck.
Yeah.
So this case, I think a lot of firms would totally miss. You know why? It's going to come into your intake department. You're going to see, all right, this little girl caused her own crash. She ran off the road to the right. She tried to recover by pulling back on the roadway. She lost control. She flipped into a telephone pole. She's the only person in the car, and she dies. I mean, there's no road defect claim. There's no cause. It's just a straight roadway there. There was no other person to sue other than her, unless you can bring a case against Toyota.
Well, and that's what we like to tell people. If you have one of these accidents in your office and you're just not sure, we're happy to look at anything. Now, we may reject 90% of the cases you send in, but then there's going to be one that's actually a products case. So if you don't mind us turning down cases, we're happy to look at anything at our expense.
Sure thing.
All right, this slide is the defense slide or the defense reconstruction, and it's flipped. But as you can see from the vehicle movements, it's essentially the same vehicle movements. We were right on with the speeds. And this one actually has a little video action, so we're going to play it for you. And so she crosses the line. You can see they show the wheel coming off. She hits the pole. You can see where it's horizontally across the roof rail. And that's where it pinned her into the car and where she sat for 2 hours. Actually, an EMT got into the vehicle with her and got behind her and picked her up, and she rested on his shoulder until she passed away. But in terms of what happened in the wreck, where that wheel came off right there at the end, and what happened right as the vehicle crossed that T intersection becomes very important in the reconstruction and the telling of this story.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and this again was a Toyota animation. And what I want to say is, let's go back a slide. This one will play. What I like to do in a case, if it's possible, is to take the defendant's position, take their information and use it against them. And this became a classic case where we could do that. And as we go forward, we'll tell you in the places where it occurred, where we were able to do that. All right, let's go to the next one. And this one plays as well. Let's just go to the next one. It shows about the same. Oh, here we go. All right, so right there at the end, you can see where the tire comes off. And as we get further into the slides, this shows it as well from the rear. Right there, Toyota is going to say that as the vehicle tipped up on that rear wheel, it experienced over 14,000 pounds of pressure. Because in the testing, we'll show you in just a minute, Toyota's position was for a good axle, in order to break it like it broke here, there has to be at least 14,900 pounds of force acting on the rim. And we'll explain to you how we use that against it.
Yeah, and the difference really between our position and theirs is not the path of the vehicle, but the issue was, when did that left rear wheel start to come loose? We say that it started to come loose way earlier, and had it not started to come loose, she could have recovered and just driven straight down the road. She wouldn't have ever went off the road and hit the telephone pole. They say it didn't come off until the very end. And so that was the whole fight of the case.
Well, as the driver's side wheels went over, let's go to the next slide and see if we can see it better. As the driver's side wheels came across the center line, Mr. Beecham was sitting right there at that intersection. And he says before she came back into her lane, that her driver's side rear wheel was wobbling. And it turned out he was actually a mechanic and worked on race cars. And he said the wheel looked like the lug nuts were loose, that it was just a wobble. And so it's that wobble that we argued was how she lost control and could not regain control of the vehicle. Now, Toyota says, no, that's not what happened. And on the right side of your screen, you see, and it's hard to see in that, the gouge mark. They say it's that gouge mark where the vehicle started tipping up and the rim started scratching into the pavement. That's when the wheel broke. And it was that she just didn't gain control of the vehicle and the wheel broke. And so that was the difference in the theories for the case.
Yeah.
And here's our gouge mark. This spot that's in the center of your screen, this is what Toyota said broke the rim off, broke the axle when the tire tipped up. And you can see it. I forget how long it was. It maybe was 15 feet long, but it's not the gouge that did it. It's when it hit this spot that you see in the middle of your screen.
Right. This was something that we had done a little prior research during the depositions of their two experts in the case. I asked them, I said, look, when do axles fail? When have you seen them fail? They both agreed that they fail if you slide into a curb. I mean, that's a big hit that can cause some really high forces in excess of 10,000 pounds on the axle. They also agreed that in rollovers, when you have what's called a slam down, which you can see in that next screen, a vehicle's airborne and it comes in, it slams down and hits the axle during the roll. Well, everybody agrees that can break an axle. what they had never, what the first expert had never seen was, he had never seen asphalt cause a overload fracture of a, because there's just now not enough force there. Their other experts said, I might have saw one 20 or 30 years ago. I can't remember what vehicle it was. I can't remember what case it was. But so I gave him a maybe on that one. But we explained to the jury how rare it was for their theory to occur by a slide like this. One of the things we did is we wanted to attack this theory of the asphalt causing the fracture of the axle. So we started looking at what does the research say. We found this paper written by Car Engineering. Anybody who does automotive product work recognizes those guys as the defense world. These people have never worked for a plaintiff. I mean, they work for the car companies and have made millions of dollars. And they do these studies to support their opinions in these cases. And there was this SAE article, which is a peer-reviewed article, says that you can only get these overload fractures of axles when the vehicle goes airborne and slams down. And so that was a big one. We found this paper, and I'm going to let Ben talk about this one. He used this one brilliantly at trial, but written by a plaintiff expert, but it's looking at this exact issue.
Well, it's looking at the side forces, and the thing about, and we'll get further into it in a minute, where do you get the forces? Where are they generated? And that became the question. Toyota, coming into this case, acted like they had never lost an axle defect case and acted like they were going to win this case no matter what. And in fact, they didn't object to anything we did except, I think, twice. And I was telling Chris before we got started, we didn't even have a charge conference in this case, because at the end of the case, Toyota thought they had won the case. They did not want us to have any appellate issues whatsoever. And so part of it became this issue of what are we going to use? What are we not going to use? And so they didn't even object to using this paper. What's the next slide?
This is the slide that
so in order to generate enough force that might even have the opportunity to break this axle, like the defense said, this paper by Mickey Gilbert, who does a lot of plaintiff's work, is a test driver, goes out and tries to tip up these vehicles and does this work. He did just coincidentally in doing this particular paper, they had a rim catch some asphalt, and it dug into the asphalt 3 inches deep. And as you can see, once it caught that asphalt, it generated enough force to actually maybe break an axle. And you can see the rim here on the right side of your screen, where the rim is actually chipped and broken.
That's one thing Ben did brilliantly with this paper and these photographs is he compared the asphalt gouge that you saw earlier, the one from this case, to that asphalt gouge, and showed that asphalt gouge from the paper is far more severe than what we have in this case. But he also compared the rim that on Lacee Dial's Toyota 4Runner to that rim, and the damage to that rim is far more severe to hers, showing that it takes a lot more force in a gouge mark to break an axle than what we ever experienced in this crash. Right. This is where we got the amount of, they got cute with us here. They went out and wanted to, they feel like they have to run tests sometimes, and in this case it bit them. I mean, most of the time when they run these tests, you can find out where they cheated a little bit or where they got a little bit loose with the facts. And they didn't cheat in this one, but they didn't need to do this. They were trying to show just how strong their axle was. And so they ran out and ran a test where they had this pendulum and they slam into the side of the axle. Now, this was a good axle. This didn't have that heat induction hardening problem that the Lacee Dial's axle had. This is a good one. Well, what it told us, what a good axle should do, it set the standard for the case, but it also helped us have something to compare that gouge mark to. Did the forces that you see here ever happen in the crash? We got to ask them that question. Well, what we found here is that when they slammed that pendulum into the axle, it was 14,900 pounds of force to break it. Well, okay, that's what it takes to break it. Now you got to find that in that gouge mark.
That's right. Well, and that's where we turn their defense on. We in essence adopted this test and said, thank you.
Yeah,
exactly. This is what it takes to break the axle. And then we went and turned those facts into something that benefited us.
Absolutely. This is this was brilliant. I mean, I just, sometimes you get, I'd say brilliant. This was lucky. I worked hard to find it, but prior to trial, I was digging through old kind of cases that one of their experts had been involved in. And I found an expert report he had filed in federal court where he said in that expert report that you have to have more than 10,000 pounds, which was consistent with their test. But it also said an axle force of this magnitude can only be applied during a collision or a rollover where the vehicle comes down on a rear wheel.
That's that airborne portion.
Yeah, that never happened. Neither one of those things ever happened in this case. So his own statement from a prior report came back to bite him. He had to say, well, I was wrong back then. It could be gouge mark. This was from the same opinion. He said at the end, this force could not be achieved when a vehicle's upright and traveling along the road or in a lateral skid. That was even more on point.
That's our case.
That's the case. And he said it could not happen in the past, and now he says it can. So he really had a problem with that. In another time, he says it only occurs in a rollover. So we did a really good job in this case of digging up what they have said in the past to use against them in this one.
This is kind of gives you an idea of what we were talking about. Jeff Germain is on the top. He's their accident reconstructionist. Dr. Fowler is the lower guy. He's their metallurgist. But in essence, in the slide you see next to them was one of their slides. In the upper left-hand corner of their slide, you see the axle tilted up. You see the tire actually tucks underneath the rim, and that's their theory, that when that rim contacts the road, that the force was so great at that point in the little divot you'll see in a minute that it snapped the axle at that point. And again, if you look, they show wheel load on the rim there in the right side of their slide. There's not even close to the damage that we showed you earlier from Mickey Gilbert's paper. It's scratched, and that's it.
Yeah. And
right here, this is the point, and it's not a video. I took a shot of their video at the point. That's the divot. That's where they say it came off. And the purpose of me doing this was to use it against them. Particularly, I use this slide in closing arguments. All right, so here we have our divot again. Let's go to the next one. And again, back up one more time.
Yeah.
One of the things our expert used, if you look around this divot, you see all the asphalt is cracked. This is asphalt laid on top of asphalt, and that became an important issue too in explaining why this particular divot could not possibly create almost 15,000 pounds of resistance. Because what we're talking about in the case is Newton's third law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if at this divot, as Toyota said, it broke the rim, then the asphalt at that point has to be able to provide more than 15,000 pounds of resistance to make the axle snap, a good axle. And here we were showing the depth. And in fact, this was a defense photograph. It's not even an inch deep. And you can see where the new asphalt is just merely sitting on top of the old asphalt. It's not bound to it. It's coming apart. It's very brittle. And here we intersect with our accident reconstructionist, and we're talking about this divot. Our accident reconstructionist had actually, in his early part of his career, worked for an asphalt company. And there are, and I'm not sure we have a slide, but there are research papers with mathematical calculations and formulas, because one of the things an asphalt company has to do is ride the roads, look at the condition of the asphalt, and do calculations to determine how long it's going to last, whether it's providing the resistance it's supposed to. So just by happenstance, our expert had 3 cores of asphalt that he had pulled from somewhere, because that's how they test asphalt. They go out, take it, bore into it, pull out a core, and then test it. And so in the upper part of your slide, you see where he took the cores he had, put them in a ram, placed them against a Toyota rim, and then pressed to see what it would take for a good piece of asphalt to shave off a piece of the asphalt with the rim. And what he did in his test, he arrived at the test basically around 3,000 pounds is the resistance force that the asphalt could provide.
Yeah, that was really important because what did we know? I mean, we couldn't go back and test Lacee's defective axle with the heat induction process. It was already broken. There's no way to find another one just like that. And so what could we do? We could, as Ben mentioned, it's for every force, there's an equal and opposite force. Well, whatever force broke that axle also gouged the roadway according to the defense theory. And so what do we look at? We looked at, well, how much force caused that mark in the road? And that was determined by our testing to be, it could not be more than 3,160 pounds, way less than what would be needed to break a good axle.
And this is just where he took papers and was able to, Bryant Buckner, do a calculation in addition to his testing. So where Toyota came in and wanted to criticize his testing, that it wasn't real world, it didn't exemplify the asphalt that was on the ground, he came in to defend that, said, look, the asphalt there was actually worse than what I'm testing. I'm giving you the benefit of good asphalt. And then I do a calculation based on research, and I come up with the same thing. It's going to take 3,000 pounds that's the maximum amount of force this asphalt is ever going to be able to provide in order to generate forces against the axle and the rim.
Yeah, and the defense expert did nothing. And
this is the paper we showed you earlier that the defense folks, Lee Carr did. They took several cars, went out and tested them, and they ran around and tried to slide them around and tried to make rim contact with the asphalt to see what sort of forces it would generate. And what you can see here is that the lateral forces, it's represented by the green bar, that the maximum lateral forces typically a driver would input into a vehicle while making an emergency steer is 0.73. So that's less than 1 G, less than 1 times the force of gravity acting on the wheel. And what the research paper showed was that in order to generate enough force, enough G's on the axle to actually break it, through their research, was at least 2.2 to 3.3 G's. And that's where the vehicle goes up in the air and slams down.
And that's important because what we know is that it never went up in the air and slammed down. The only forces that were placed on this rim and wheel and axle during the whole thing were the ones she put in through her movement.
So this is a paper, again, using the defense to work against them. They brought us this paper, so we started to use it. Let's go to the next slide. So our expert took this and he manipulated it to show exactly what I just told you. And at the bottom of the screen, he put in his own information about what would have been generated here, and it would have been less than 2 G's, way less. And so let's go to the next screen. So what was important when we start talking about the G forces on the side of this rim and going through the paper that we just showed you, well, this is Jeff Germain, the defendant's accident reconstruction. This is his calculations, his work. So what were the lateral G forces that he came up with that were acting upon the rim? Here he shows you the maximum, based on his own calculations, were 0.85 G's. Their own research paper says that's not enough to break the rim. And we showed that just couldn't happen according to their own theory. Now, under our theory, 3,000 pounds of force, we're right there in that range.
You always want to try to take the defense's work, turn it against them, take their theory, turn it against them. And I was really proud of the work we did in this case doing that. I mean, this is a lot of, you can see going through this, a lot of our best evidence was stuff they gave us. And this was just another example.
And what we're going to come up to, I'm not sure where we're going to come into it in a minute. Looking at our accident reconstruction there in the bottom of the screen, at the point where Mr. Beecham saw the wheel wobbling to the point where we all agreed it came off at the divot. From there to the divot, the rotations to the tire that had to occur, our experts said that was about 2 seconds. So even though we claimed it broke, it stayed in place while it rotated for about 2 seconds. And then let's go to the next one.
And had it not, she would have and you see that arrow pointing down the roadway and the other arrow pointing towards the telephone pole. That was our theory. Had the axle not broke, she would have continued on down the road. Because it broke and wobbled for 2 seconds before it actually came all the way off, she lost control.
She had no lateral control of the vehicle.
Yeah, she couldn't get back control and lost and went into the telephone pole.
And again, this is again showing, our divot. We see the tire marks in the grass, and there became a contention that about the rollover. In order for the vehicle to tip up, it's actually got to have about 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of moment to lift the vehicle up. And what we were showing here is that actually this vehicle tilted up because the wheel snapped. And what we were showing with the circle in the grass is that the driver's side of the vehicle never caught in the grass. There was no other opportunity for the vehicle to make a furrow in essence and cause the vehicle to flip. That in essence, it was the axle braking that put us in the position of the vehicle rolling over.
Yeah. This was a neat little thing we found out was this guy, Barry Beecham, and I'll come back to him in a moment, but to get from where he saw the wobble first on it, where he said they looked like the lug nuts were loose on the left rear tire, was 8 revolutions of the tire. So the tire would have went around 8 times, and it would have taken about 2.5 seconds. And he also said the vehicle fishtailed. That was all consistent with our theory, with our actual reconstructionist, and with the axle fracturing. This guy, Barry Beecham, said this way before we were even in the case. I mean, it was amazing how accurate that turned out to be.
But I did want to mention, Chris mentioned earlier that when we inherited the case, they had already put up an accident reconstructionist. He had been deposed, and he was just absolutely wrong. I've never had a case like that before. And the way Chris decided to handle it, I thought was really smart, and it worked. That's all the defense talked about in our hearings was, they put up their, they don't know what's happening here, Judge. They've even put up an expert who didn't know what he was talking about. Chris got up an opening statement and just honestly told the jury in the middle of opening that, hey, this is what they're going to tell you, and they're right. We put up an expert. He was wrong. He didn't know what he was talking about. And under the rules of ethics, I can't put a witness up that I know is not telling the truth. So what did we do? We went out and hired another guy to come in and do it right. And when we talked to the jury after the case, nobody had a comment about it. They didn't hold it against us. So I think it's an important lesson to learn that if you've got something bad in the case that could hurt you, you better go ahead and tell the jury about it and let them know you made a mistake or here's something that's not good, and be honest with it.
Absolutely. This became important, and not because of what impact it had on the jury, but I guess the legal implications of appeal after the verdict. Well, what we found in their warranty repairs was that they had a lot of broke axles that people were bringing in the vehicle into the shop, and they had all these broken axles, and they would say that I'm bringing it in and my axle was wobbling as I would drive it in. And so it was kind of half fractured wobble, just like Barry Beecham had said. Now, the rules and the judge kept it out. He and I'll tell you a little bit about more of that later, but he kept that out. And at the time, I was really upset because this was big evidence, but it didn't end up having a big impact on the jury because they never saw it and we won anyway. But I wanted it in because there were so many people saying the same thing that our theory, consistent with our theory. We went out and hired an expert in the case, found the best guy I could find, a guy named Kendall Clark. And Kendall had cancer. He had just found out like 2 weeks before, or a week before trial, that he had cancer and it was terminal. He called me actually and said, I'm not coming, and I kind of get it. Like, what's the point? I'm not working, anymore. And I was able to talk. Ben and I were in the hotel. It was a panic. And I was like, man, our expert's not coming. It's our design expert. We lose on directed verdict without him. And I talked him. I got him to agree to come. He was very, very weak, very, very feeble. It actually came out in trial that he had cancer. and
Left his treatment to come testify.
Yeah, left his treatment to come testify. Well, I found this guy to be an expert because he had actually written a paper on this exact topic. And so he had written a failure analysis of induction hardened automotive axle. So I'm like, this has got to be the guy. He had worked for NASA, the Navy, Ford Motor Company, Hyundai, U.S. Air Force, Army Corps of Engineers. I thought he had great credentials. He's now deceased, and he did succumb of that cancer, which is sad. But he told us about how the fracture did happen right at that step up axis where that geometric feature was. He talked to us about how induction hardening can go wrong. He showed us from their own standards how this axle failed, their own standards, that you can't have cracks and harmful flaws in the axle. Yet they had them. This crack existed before the wreck ever happened. The crack was there, and that's why the axle was weak. That's why when it got sideways, it broke. It was defective because it had a crack in it. That makes all the sense in the world. I actually used something kind of unique. I took a pool noodle, like a swimming pool float noodle, and I bent it, a good one that didn't have any cracks in it, and it just bent and bent and bent. But then I had taken a knife and I had placed a cut in one of them and cracked it. And then I bent it and it broke. I tried that probably a dozen. I bet I had bought 20 noodles and practiced it to see if it was going to work in front of the jury before I tried it. But I use that in closing to show, ladies and gentlemen, that crack made all the difference in the world. That crack was already there. That's why it broke when it shouldn't have. He showed us the geometric features up close under electron microscope. He looked under electron microscope at the grain size, which showed that it failed Toyota's engineering standards. He looked at it and saw that the microscopic structure of the steel was not uniform. It had different varying sizes, which it cannot have to meet their standard. And then we really took all that information, and we started putting it together for the jury. We started to show them, after we educated them on all this evidence, we said, okay, now how did all this work together to cause the crash? And this was probably, when I say they gave us a lot of gifts, there is no better gift than this one. But before Ben tells you all about it, let me say, when I first saw it, I panicked.
Well, what happened was Jeff Germain took a Toyota, the same model that we had. He went out, he pulled the axle out, and at that point where Chris has been showing you that we had a failure, he actually sawed halfway through it so that the axle was only 50%. And he put his wheel back on, he goes out, he videotapes everything. He drives this Toyota around and around and around. Axle does fine, he does all these shifts, nothing happens. And then you see him hit the brake and it dips up, front end goes down, the wheel pops off and rolls out. So in his deposition, he says, look, I drove this thing around with only 50% of the axle in place. It will not break. Your theory does not work. In fact, Jeff Germain, I had to stab the brakes and jam the axle to make it lock and actually crack it and make it break. So it's so strong it won't break. And so when we first saw that, Chris and I both were like, they're going to kill us with this. And as the trial, when we started, the defense talked to the judge about it. Judge, I'm telling you, we got a demonstration we're going to show. I'm telling you, this is going to be the end of the case. And so in meeting with our expert, he had another view on it. Let's go to the next one. But
before he goes to the next slide, you remember Barry Beecham said the wobble happened for 2.5 seconds. That means the wheel stayed in the wheel well for 2.5 seconds. And our theory was that the wobble started 2.5 seconds earlier, but the wheel stayed in there before it finally came out. So when they did this demonstration, they said the wheel comes out instantly. There's no 2.5 seconds to it. It comes out that second. That's what worried me.
All right. So right before the demonstration shows the axle brakes, and I don't think this is a video. He had videos of himself inside. So my expert brings me into a conference room and goes, look, he's tricking you here. Let me show you how. So if we do the timing and we put this in at 0 seconds, if you look at the tachometer and the speedometer, He's at 3,000 RPMs, and he's right at, I think, about 30 or 40 miles an hour. All right, this is where he is. Axle is not broken. All right, go to the next slide. All right, he still says the axle's not broken in his video, but what we did was looked at it slide by slide. And so we're into it 0.6 of a second, and all of a sudden our expert goes, the RPMs go up and the speedometer goes to 80 miles an hour. And so Bryant Buckner says the reason this happened is the axle is already broken. At the point it breaks, it starts free spinning and it runs the speedometer up. Well, Jeff Germain still has not pressed the brakes yet. You know, that stab braking I mentioned a minute ago, where he testified that's where I broke the axle, it hadn't happened yet.
Yeah, so it's still in there.
Still in the wheel well.
It's still in the wheel well, but it's broken. That's absolutely consistent with our theory.
All right, so our expert syncing everything up, he takes the same 0.6 of a second where the speedometer is doing 80 miles an hour, where the axle has broken, but he shows the horizon line and puts a green line there and shows that in reference to the front end of the truck. All right, go to the next slide. Well, 2 seconds in, that's where the front end dips. So 2 seconds after the axle breaks, that's when Jeff Germain hits the brakes. And that's when the front end goes down. That's when the wheel comes out. So using this demonstration, we were able to show from the defendant's own work that the wheel will stay in after the axle breaks. And I have to tell you, after we put this on in the plaintiff's case, I mean, we asked the defendant, do you mind if we use the video? He's like, oh, go ahead. He wanted to come into evidence. When they put their recon expert on the stand, they did not mention this video one time. They didn't talk about it at all. I mean, we totally took it away from them and showed that they were rigging the game.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was thank you, Toyota, by the way. And yeah, this was one of those times where we just completely took what but going into the trial, this was all we heard about. They were bragging about it to us. This was a zero offer case too. They offered us nothing going into trial and said, this is a defense verdict 10 times out of 10. You guys cannot win this case. We've never lost one. And the basis for that was this demonstration showing that the wheel came out instantly. And I credit Ben and our actual reconstructionist for really destroying it, taking what they thought was their strongest point and making it ours. I mean, remember the 2 second wobble where it stayed in the wheel well had to happen for us to be right. Their own test showed that the wheel would stay in the wheel well for 2 seconds after it broke.
And there's Mr. Beecham and he's showing where he saw the wheel wobbling. And I did the first part of the closing in the case, and I told the jury that the case was really about two things. First, it was about force. All the things we've told you about the force that it couldn't generate. And the second thing was wobble. And so I told the jury, if you believe us on the force and you believe us on the wobble and you believe the demonstration that Toyota did that we showed you works for us, then it's a plaintiff's verdict. That's what you got to do. And so another piece of that pie was the 8 revolutions that we said the tire made after the axle had broken. And what our experts showed, we're looking now at the brake housing and the housing that would fit into the rim. And on the left side, that's the part that stayed attached to the axle. On the right side is what was actually attached to the tire. And so what our expert was able to forensically show was that there were 8 different marks where the tire was wobbling. And every time it would wobble, it would hit against that piece that you see for the brakes that stayed attached to the axle. And it would create a mark inside this piece on the tire, on the wheel. And so because of those marks, it required at least 8 revolutions. And the different marks showed that it actually came loose, stayed in place for at least 2 seconds, and then came off when it hit the divot.
Yeah, and those marks can't take place unless it's wobbling. Those 2 pieces never would come in contact unless it's wobbling and allow it to come in to scratch. My favorite part of the trial was when I did rebuttal close, I took a flashlight and I held that piece on the right, and I've shined what you can't see because of the 8 marks we have colored there. Behind them are these shining scratch marks that were very, very visible, but you could take a flashlight and they would brighten up. And I really just told the jury, when did they ever explain how these 8 marks came in here? How these 8 marks that are completely consistent with the distance Barry Beecham said, completely consistent with the test that they gave, the 2 seconds. I mean, completely consistent with our entire theory. When did they ever tell you how those eight scratch marks came in the 8 revolutions that it took to get from where we say the wheel came loose to where it came off? And they had no answer for that. We again went through the papers. We talked about again how there was never enough forces to fracture this axle unless it was defective. And we talked a lot about Lacee. I'll tell you the one thing that I did in this case that I wasn't planning on doing it. I'd heard this from a friend who's a lawyer. He done this in a case. But when I went and met with the family before the trial began, the mom, who was just a sweetheart and was completely heartbroken about the loss of her daughter, kept holding something in her hand.
The only daughter.
Yeah, the only daughter.
The youngest child.
Yeah, had some boys, but this was her only daughter. And she kept holding something in her hand. And after the meeting where I met with them at their house, I said, what was it you were holding there? And she had a clip. And her daughter had worn to the prom right before she died. And it was a hair clip, and it was probably worth a couple dollars. But since she died, the mom had carried that everywhere that she had gone. And so when I had the mom on the stand, I asked her, I was like, how much do you have your hair clip? And she said that it did. She did. And I said, how much is it worth? And she said $7 or $8. I said, how much is it worth to you? And the measure of damages in this case was what was the life worth to her. And so what we were able to argue was there are things in life that may not be valuable to other people. That hair clip was not worth more than $7 to anybody else in the world. That hair clip was is incalculable value to her. Her daughter was incalculable value to her. And so we were able to tie that back into our damages ask.
Well, and the thing we knew that if we could get a verdict, it was going to be a big verdict, was almost every day during the trial, the courthouse custodian staff would leave us goodies and a note in our little side room off the courtroom that said their church or their local organization, they were all praying for us. And I've just never had that happen before in trial, where you have the court staff rooting for you. And when we got to the end of the trial, they had these big burly sheriff's deputies that were in the courtroom the entire time. They came up to us after the trial and told us that once this trial started, there was 4 or 5 of them. They would meet in the bottom of the courthouse every day during the trial to pray for our trial team and to pray for the family. And that was just again, something I've never experienced.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, you work on cases that change you, and this was one that changed me. I was able to see God at work, and this family was a family of deep and abiding faith, and the case started off so wrong. I mean, and we were so behind the 8 ball in so many ways, and then it came together so right. And I saw this family praying, and I saw the people, the courthouse custodians praying, and I saw the security guards, the deputies praying, and Ben and I. And it was one of those instances where I just know that's what was going on. God was working behind the scenes to help us here.
Well, Ms. Dial, after the trial, in the closing argument, we gave the jury a range for a verdict. It was an 8-figure verdict. The midpoint was not 12 million. And so after the verdict, and I think she told you, that Lacee's favorite number was 12. And again, just one of those things that just makes you stop and realize, somebody else had a hand in making this happen. Again, I was just privileged to know this family and to work for them and to watch all this unfold. It's one of those cases that was hard. But it's one, if you have one come in your office they may look hard and they may be hard, but usually there's a family on the other side that deserves to have it looked at hard to determine if the product had anything to do with it.
And kind of to close, I mentioned earlier about some appellate issues. This was a fun little fact in the case. There were, as Ben told you, there were only 2 objections in the trial. We lost both of them. They won both objections in front of the judge. I was upset about the second one. But at the time of the second one, which was near the end of the trial, and this is the law in Georgia as of now, but you have to, and this case was tried in South Carolina, right over the line in Anderson, just on the other side of Hartwell, Georgia. And we had there, you have to object contemporaneously when evidence was admitted. So they, after trial, they had all these things that they said went wrong with the trial. That, you know, after they lost, they suddenly found so many wrong things with the trial. We didn't, as Ben mentioned, we didn't even have a charge conference. At the end, we had submitted our jury charges. They had submitted their jury charges. And the defense lawyer said, you know, Your Honor, there is no need for a charge conference for us to try to figure out which ones of these. We're going to use all of theirs because there has been no error in this trial. We're going to win, and we don't want them to have anything to appeal. So, you know, even going into close, they were still really confident. And earlier in the trial,
Well, this is when you offered the warranty material.
Yeah, this was when I offered the warranty material. Before that, the judge, the defense lawyer objected. He said, you know, I object to this warranty material coming in. And then at the end of his argument, he says, Your Honor, we're about to introduce a reversible error into a trial that has no errors. He admitted there's no errors in this case. And after that fact, there was not another objection. He never objected after he made that statement. And so when they did come along after this fact and start pointing to a lot of errors, I was able to remind the court that the defense, before they lost, said there were none. And that was pretty effective. I remember the judge laughing about that in the motion for new trial. And they never really even appealed this case after that we were able to get it resolved after that hearing. The motion new trial was denied. So anyway, it's a great case to work on. We really enjoyed doing the case. It was, as Ben mentioned, an honor to represent this family. It looks like we got a question. So, so what firm defended this case? This was defended by Joel Smith and out of South Carolina, who is one of the best defense lawyers that I've ever worked against, and a gentleman.
Yeah, I was going to say, trying this case with him, he was nothing but an absolute gentleman. I had nothing but good things to say about him. Yeah,
Joel's a great lawyer.
Smart lawyer.
He did a good job in this case. Any other questions? Well, not seeing any other questions. Here's one. Oh, thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. Yeah, we've had fun doing this today.
And again, if anything comes up, you think about this case or you want to ask about it, feel free to email either of us at the office. Yeah, my emails, I guess, is provided in the information that you have. If not, it's pretty easily found on our firm's website, beasleyallen.com. And see, how many hours did you put in this case? Holy moly. Yeah, thank goodness we don't keep up with hours. Yeah, I don't, you know, gosh, I couldn't calculate. I worked on the case for years. There were times in those years where that's all I did. Times when I did less on it. Ben came in and probably you started several in the last year of the case. It was pending for 6 years because 2 law firms ended up working on it. So yeah, and so it was a really old case by the time it went to trial. I would guess thousands. I mean, it was a lot. Expenses in the case, yeah. So this is a funny story. Before every trial that I've ever done at Beasley Allen, Cole Portis, who's the head of the products liability section of our firm, kind of gives me a call, and he doesn't want us to ever be concerned about you know, losing the case. Just go to win and don't worry about it. And so one of the things he always says is, you know, don't worry about it, have fun, you know, go do your best, go win. And he never made that call before this one. He never called me. And so at some point I called him up. I think it was Friday before Monday. I kept waiting on that phone call.
And I said, Cole, I said, you've called me every time and said, it doesn't matter, do your best, go out there, don't be afraid to lose. And I said, I never heard from you on this one. And Cole said, Chris, you've got $800,000 in expenses going into trial. It matters. You need to win. And so, yeah, that was the number that was going into trial. It ended up being a little bit more than that because of the trial expense, but it was a lot more than normal. That was because we had to inherit the expenses from a previous firm, and we had to completely start over from expert. So that was probably double what it should have been.
Your time's up.
Yeah, well, it looks like our time's up. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks, Ben, for joining me. Thank you all for being on the show this morning with us, and we'll be back next month. We'll be looking for our announcements for the next webinar. We're going to be talking with Kendall Dunson. Kendall's going to be talking about on-the-job third-party cases when you can get around comp. And so looking forward to what he has to say about that. And thank you again, Ben, for being with us today. And thank you all.